It's time. It's time to do a massive unhaul. Hey there, it's Olivia Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and I'm here to let some books go from my shelves. I tend to haul in a lot of books, I tend to read a lot of books, and I do think it's healthy for them to move through and only keep the best ones on my shelf. I've also been having a bit of a mediocre reading month. As of when I'm filming this, it's June, and I had a lot of 3 stars. The majority of my reading was 3 stars. That's not the way I want to be. So I also had a lot of DNFs, and so we're going to start with the DNFs, and then we're going to move into the rest of the books that will no longer be living in Olivia Savannah's library. Let's get down to the books. The first book that I DNF'd was Not Good for Maidens by Tori Bovalino, and also The Devil Makes Three by Tori Bovalino. They're both by the same author, and I believe I started reading Not Good for Maidens, which is a Gobbling Market Christina Rossetti retelling, and I read the first 100 pages and it just wasn't capturing me. I just wasn't falling in love with the world or falling in love with any of the characters, and so just because it wasn't captivating me, and I'd been reading a lot of 3 stars that month and could predict that this was going to be a 3-star rating and not above that, I thought it was good to let it go. And I didn't actually get very far in The Devil Makes Three. I just gave it 30 pages, but I wanted to see if another book by this author would be for me, or if it was just going to be the writing issue. And I think it is a bit of the writing, because I was feeling exactly the same way as when I read Not Good for Maidens. I just wasn't connecting to anybody, I wasn't connecting to the setting or the plot, and so I just gave up at the 30-page mark. I also had a friend recently read this and say that they found it okay. So all in all, these were looking like they were going to be 2-3 stars for me, and what I'm really looking for when I'm reading is a 4 or 5 stars. And when I say those ratings, I mean I'm not looking for something I'm going to finish and be like, that was okay. I'm looking for something I'm going to finish and be like, I liked that, or I really enjoyed it. And these weren't going to end up that way as far as my predictions could tell me. I also DNF'd When Women Were Dragons at about the 100-page mark. Once again, 100 pages tend to be where I often find whether I'm going to like it or not. I really struggled with this one. It felt quite white feminism to me, and also a very particular kind of feminism that's really hard-boiled, if that's even a way to describe feminism. It didn't feel like it was going to be intersectional, it didn't feel like it was going to be inclusive, it felt like it was going to be telling one particular story that only fit for one period of time and not really be as transcendent or crossing across that. Sorry, I didn't even say what this is about. It's about women, and there's like a metaphorical thing where women are turning into dragons and flying away, and it's supposed to be a bit symbolic for the suffragette movement and like women stepping into their rights. Even though the dragoning was happening, it was already feeling quite repetitive. The fact that they would have interjections from men where they would talk about the dragoning and then be like, history was erased, and then we get back to the storyline, and all the time the narrative voice was saying, I don't understand why my aunt did this, or I don't understand why this woman did this. And I was like, sis, you don't understand anything, why are you even telling me the story? So that got repetitive and annoying fast, and because it was already annoying me within 100 pages, I thought the rest of the book might annoy me just as much, and so I shouldn't finish it. I very quickly DNF'd The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I have been meaning to try this for a very long time, but it's a slave narrative. It's got slavery in the story, and I really struggle with slave narratives lately. I think there are 2 things in particular that I'm quite oversaturated on as a reader myself, and that is World War II fiction, because I read so much of it across my lifetime, because I was really reading that a lot when I was a young child, and then I read it all the way up until teenagerhood, and I just read too many of them. And also slavery narratives. As a black person reading fiction, it can get overdone, it can get exhausting. We know the slavery story now. I'm not saying that you should never write a slave narrative, but for me, the way that I want to consume it is with a new, fresh lens. I've read so much of it. Again, it was something I was reading quite early on as a teenager, all the way through into adulthood, and I've seen it done in literary fiction and historical fiction time and time again. I now need it to be done in a different way. This was slipping into the narrative I'm already familiar with, and I didn't want to read another one. I just couldn't do it. Milkman by Anna Burns. I DNF'd this very quickly, about 30 pages, again, like The Water Dancer. It wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. The writing style was not working for me. Again, the type of topic and things that it was talking about, sexism, I could see that it was going to be very on the nose. It was already quite on the nose, and it wasn't my vibe. It was such a Man Booker winner, which this book is. It is a Man Booker winner, and Man Booker winner books are not particularly my type of book. Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I gave this 100 pages again. I gave it the full span of my attention. This was a kind of fairy tale-esque sounding book. It reads like a fairy tale. It really does read like a fairy tale, even though it's a contemporary story about a young girl who washes up to this area and nobody knows where this goes from or what's happened to her. It was literally just starting to get into the fairy tale, but I was already exhausted by the fairy tale-esque writing style, and I know other people are going to read that writing style and think that's lovely, that's beautiful, but for me I was just like, it's nice, it's not for me. So this is really a case of, I don't think this book is bad, it's just not what I wanted to read at that point in time, and I cannot see myself picking it up in a year or two, so I shouldn't keep it on my shelf there. Oh, this was a painful DNF. The Mill House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji. I literally hauled this in fairly recently, but it wasn't clicking. And then the murder mystery itself was not gripping me either, so I thought, not the one for me, unfortunately. Even though I wanted to read more translated fiction this month, it just wasn't happening. Last one that I'd call a DNF is The Elemental Detectives by Patrice Lawrence. I read 100 pages of this again, which actually put me a full quarter of the way through, and my mind was wandering. I was reading the words on the page and I was thinking about something else, and that's not what you want to do when you read a book. You want to be thinking about the book, you want to be focused on the book. So this is a middle grade fantasy and has like elemental elements to it. It's set in historical London, but the elemental magical people exist who control elements like water, and dragons exist and different things, but it just wasn't catching my attention, and I read a lot of middle grade fantasy, so that was not the issue. I'm so gutted about it though, because I think this cover is stunning. I love the cover and I really wanted to love the book. It just wasn't happening. We've got some books that I'm claiming as ones that were on my TBR but I'm unhauling unread, so that's the section that we are in now. And I did read the prologue to The Colour of Magic by Terry Patchett, so you could call this a DNF. But I'm actually calling it Unhaul Unread. There are multiple people who have read this and enjoyed it and still said I probably wouldn't like it. After I heard, I think Scott from Gunpowder and Fiction compared it to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy briefly, and I was like, okay, so now I know this book is definitely not for me, because I like weird and whimsical, but I don't like weird and whimsical that much to that extent. And so even though I haven't read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I know that is definitely not the book for me, and so knowing that it falls into that realm of weird and strange fantasy, I now know it's also not for me. I kept Wicked by Gregory Maguire for a long time because I know it's one of Simone's books that she really enjoys and she really likes this author, even though she has some issues with sometimes his representation of women. I've also been to see the musical of Wicked. I've heard that this book is actually very different from the musical, so I've had it on my shelf for a couple of years now and I've not picked it up, and when I was cleaning things out, it looked like its time had been up. It'd been on my shelf for long enough without me having read it to know it needs to go. We have Afrofuturism 2.0, which I'm really sad to be letting go of, but I just know it's not for me. So I got this one when I was doing my dissertation on Afrofuturism, which girl got it first, girl had a good time writing it, but I just never got around to actually reading this book. I didn't have enough time to read all of the material that I bought because I was overexcited and I bought a lot of material. And this is the one that's still left on my shelf, the only one that's left on my TBR from that research process. And I actually started reading this, I read the introduction and I looked at the individual essays. It's also an anthology, I don't read that many anthologies. I looked at the individual essays and a lot of them were ones I was uninterested in because they look at Afrofuturism through the lens of science, religion and music, and a bit through literature, but predominantly what my interest in Afrofuturism is in music, but in an active notion, not so as in studying the music, just as in experiencing it and being part of it, loving Janelle Monáe for example. But it's also particularly in the literature, and it doesn't seem like it was serving enough of the literature end to me. And it was a very academic, hard non-fiction book. And I do read hard non-fiction, but I often read hard non-fiction that has a thread of narrative through it. And this is, as an anthology, does not possess that thread of narrative, that thread of storytelling voice. Must-love books, A Proof by Shauna Robinson. I don't like unhauling proofs unread, but I looked up on Goodreads the reviews for this and it actually just, people were ripping into it. And the way that the main character sounded like a main character I was going to struggle with. I'm very much a character-driven reader. If I can't get behind the character, I struggle to get behind the story. And so I think this is not going to be one for me. And I'm also gonna finally let go of Dream Country by Ashaye Brown. This is a young adult fantasy book. I've heard that the main character, or one of the siblings in this, is quite alike to Ronan Lynch, which is a character from one of my favorite series, The Raven Cycle. So of course that kind of caught my attention. It's also like a black mythology fantasy book, but oh, it matches my hair. But I just never pick it up. It's been years. This came out in April 2021, and I was really looking at my oldest review copies on my shelf, and I read one of them in June, but I wasn't going to read this anytime soon, so it needed to go. It's been there for a while now. And last but not least, we're getting into the books that I've already read but I've decided I'm not going to keep. So the first one we have here is I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki by Baek. Sehee, thank you so much to the people who got me this for my birthday. It was actually bought for me twice and I had to return one. I think this is from Hannah, but thank you so much, Hannah. I really enjoyed the experience of reading this because I also made tteokbokki and read it and ate the food, which was really, really nice. This disappointed me in a few ways, and one of them was the fact that it rarely actually mentions tteokbokki in the book, and I'm a person who is largely attracted to books by their titles, so I was really excited to hear more about tteokbokki. It's not involved, so that was sad. But also I think the psychiatrist that she sees in this did a really bad job of like serving the person she was supposed to be helping, and so that really impacted my experience reading this book overall. I'm unhauling The Secret Barrister, which was a 5-star read for me and a new favourite of the year, and I loved it to pieces. And so because I loved it so much, I got this book secondhand from the secondhand bookshop. It's not in the perfect condition, it's a bit dirty, it's a bit worn, the pages are quite yellow, and so I'm going to pass it on to somebody else or return it to the secondhand bookshop because I think it is a great book that people should really read. It's about the stories of the UK law and how it is a broken system and how it needs to be improved. I learned so much. I found it very, very readable, and I want to read more by The Secret Barrister because they have more books out, but I liked it so much that I want to get myself a shiny brand new copy, and that's why I'm unhauling this one. This really broke my heart, but I'm unhauling Betty by Tiffany McDaniel, and Tiffany McDaniel wrote one of my favourite all-time books, which is The Summer That Melted Everything. This is her second novel, and it just didn't get me in the same way. It's a historical fiction book, but it just felt like it didn't have a connecting thread or a connecting theme other than following these characters' lives. And the titular nature of this book is Betty, so that's the main character. I feel like Betty got buried in all of the stories around her siblings and her family members, and it wasn't as focused on her as I would have wanted it to be. So that's really sad. But also this is one of those books that I got in the Waterstones Boxing Day sale. I believe it cost me like £3.50, and it's signed by the author. Lovely hardcover, but there's no point in me keeping books I'm never going to read again and didn't love on my shelves. I don't have space for that. I don't have time for that. I read Beasts of Prey by Ayana Gray. This is a young adult fantasy book. I had a good enough time with it, but I just didn't fall in love. I found it was middle of the road to me. It read like lots of stories I've read before, and while it was unique in the mythology sense, I just didn't personally love it as much as I could have. I think it's a good story, and I think somebody who enjoys young adult fantasy more than I do these days is going to pick it up and they're going to fall in love with it, and I'm going to be glad to have contributed to that experience. Meeting Ayana Gray though was lovely. She's a lovely author, and I wish her all the best in future endeavours. I'm unhauling The Haunting of Aveline Jones. Hannah, please don't come for me. I read this one for a reading vlog, so I'll leave a link to that down below. It's a middle grade horror book, and it was a nice enough time. It was a lovely story. It's the first one in a series, and I know I'm not going to continue the series, so I don't need to keep it on my shelves. And while it was a nice enough story, I think I need to read more middle grade horror to really know if this is the case or not. But I love my horror to be really gory and really scary, and the middle grade just, it's too soft for me. So I need to read a few other middle grade horrors to experiment and see if it's just the genre as a whole is too soft for me. But gonna pass this along. I am also unhauling Brown Girls. So this is a kind of poetic almost story about brown girls growing up in the Bronx, black girls and more, in terms of their skin shade, and they're just talking about their experience, but it's using the collective we for their voices, and I just wanted more individualism than that. I just wanted to hear more of their individual stories and how even though they're a group and a breadth of people, they all have such unique experiences, and I think the we narrative did not quite allow for that openness and that individuality to come out. That's what I look for in stories like this. So it was lovely. I read it in a day because it's quite short, but it's ultimately not what I wanted. Like a lot of these ones I'm unhauling because they were just okay, but this one I'm unhauling because it was not good, and that's Everything's Fine by Cecilia Rabess. This is like a story where this black liberal woman meets this white conservative man, and they hit it off and they have a spark and emotion, but it's about if they can actually have a relationship with each other when their political views are just so different. And I don't think this book did a good job of actually answering that question that it presents to the reader. And I think, what is the point of a book if it presents a question and does not even answer the question? It infuriated me to no end. I thought I was going to hate Josh, the white conservative, the most, but plot twist, I hated Jess, the black liberal, the most, because she was the biggest hypocrite on the planet, and I could not stand the way that they failed to communicate with each other. I did think this book was a bit repetitive and boring around the halfway mark, and I just did not have a good time. So it's definitely not staying on my shelves. We have The Ophelia Girls by Jane Healey. I read this one and I just thought it was okay. I went into it for the historical fiction Shakespeare element to it, with the drowning girls and recreating the Ophelia scene. I loved everything to do with that, and it served what I wanted on that front. But I don't think it did a very good job with the present day storyline that we're following, or at least it did a mediocre job with it. I did find it quite predictable. It didn't go into as much depth as I wanted to with the emotions I wanted it to bring across and to discuss, and it also had an adult in a relationship with someone who was under 18, and I'm not saying it was supporting that relationship, I actually think it was condoning it, but I struggle to read that personally. I find it quite uncomfortable as a reading experience, and therefore I will not have fond memories of this book, and I don't want to keep it on my shelf. Hedge Witch by Skye McKenna. This is the first one in a young adult fantasy series about this girl who is learning to be a witch so that she can find her lost mother. It was sweet. It was nice. I don't have anything bad to say about this book. I enjoyed it for the most part, but I know I'm not going to continue on with this series, so I'm letting this book go. I have Wolfwood by Mariana Bear. This was a young adult, like contemporary with magical realism elements to it that I really enjoyed reading. I had a good time with it. I thought it was lovely, and actually this was one that I was dithering on about whether to keep or not, because it's one of those 3 stars that's doing the most. It's a middle of the road book, but I enjoyed my experience enough for me to want to keep it on my shelf. But when I put my review up on Instagram, I got a response from someone who is a friend of mine from the blogger world, back from when I was blogging, and she was like, oh, that actually sounds quite good, I would like to read it. And I thought, I found it okay, but it sounds like something that this person is actually going to really enjoy. I should pass along my copy to her. So that's where this one is going. We have In the Watchful City. I recently read this sci-fi novella and it was a good enough time. I liked it. I did want it to delve a bit more into some of the world building elements and some of the characterization that it had going on, but I did like the themes that it talked about, and how, even though it was a science fiction book, it kind of threw in some of the storytelling elements that you often see in fantasy and contemporary. So I like how this pushed the boat out a bit more into what you expect to see sci-fi, and it was very unique and different. I like that about it. I just didn't love the book enough to keep it on my shelves. And we're down to the last 2, which are both middle grade books. So the first one we have is the Lizzie and Belle Mysteries. The first book, I'm going to give this one to my future niece or nephew. So I think this is one that can be really good to read, and I did mention that there was a book that dealt with slavery in a more of a unique way, and I think this one did. It's a murder mystery, but it's set during the times when black people are started to become accepted, where black people are leaving plantations and embarking on their own journeys, and so slavery is kind of happening in the background. But of course, as we have 2 black children as our main characters, it does impact how they go about solving this mystery and how people view them and how they can ask questions or do their investigating. And I like that it did not ignore the fact that slavery is happening in this historical period, but expertly tied it into the story in a well-managed way. So my niece or nephew is not born yet, but my sister did say that I can give her books that I think could be good for them to read when they're older already. So that's where this one is going. And similar story, this other black middle grade book that I read is going to go to my future niece or nephew, and this is Marv and the Pool of Peril. It's one of those like early reader chapter books, so still got lots of illustrations but got more pages than otherwise, and I think it could be a really good one for them to read because it's got like the superhero element, it's got a black main character, but it's also a lot about believing in yourself and overcoming your fears, and I think it handled that very well. I actually enjoyed this one and I thought it was good, but now I'm at the stage where there's someone in my life in the future who can appreciate appreciate reading middle grade even more than I can as an adult, and so of course I'm going to share the love and give it to them. And there you have it. That's my unhaul. I feel like I unhauled a lot of books. I feel like I'm going to have more space for new books. Actually, I've actually filled the space where these go already, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but it's always good to like cleanse my shelves of the books that I didn't get along with and just pass on more books. So please let me know in the comment section down below what was the last book you DNF'd or unhauled. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. And don't forget to hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. And you know what they say, onwards and upwards. Excelsior!